Ready? Can you hear me?
Well, welcome everyone to today's webinar from the Open Group. Before I hand over to our speaker, Peter Harrod of Orbis Software, I would just like to go over a few housekeeping issues just to keep the event moving forward smoothly. We encourage everyone to ask questions during this event. That's one of the main objectives of the events that we deliver as part of the Open Group. The best way to submit a question during the event is to use the QA text facility in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. If you do submit a question, the best way to do that is to address it to all. That way everyone gets to see all of the questions that are being asked. And we'll answer as many of the questions we possibly can at the end of the event. I'd also be interested to learn that this whole event is being recorded, so it includes the audio and visual, and you'll be able to gain access to this recording from tomorrow. You also get an email giving you a link to how you can access this recording. If you find this useful, if you have any local technical problems, or if you have to leave the event early for any other reason. So any further ado, let me hand you over to Peter Harrod. Over to you, Peter.
Okay. Thank you, Ken, for having me, and thanks to everyone for attending. Let's start off by explaining what's brought me to give this presentation. I work for Orbis Software, a maker of modeling software, particularly for EA and BPA, and architecture and business process analysis. And one of the things that we highlight as a strength is we are very flexible and we can support different models in the repositories. So BM diagrams, Archimate diagrams. But of course, this immediately lays a landmine for us, something that colleagues often get asked. Well, that's really great, but BIM talks about one set of objects, TOGAF talks about a different set of objects, a third, and then got, say, DODAF or COBIT and so on. So we may get asked, okay, so we align these objects. What's your recommendations? Do you have standard models for that? We take advantage of that. So with that in mind, I wanted to share some of the rules of thumb that we've come up with, guidelines that we apply faced with this challenge, because it's not specific to the tool, it's much a generic challenge facing the industry in general. Now, to do a few words on scope and what I will cover and what I won't. I will be covering off the we apply in finding these different models, in understanding where the crossovers are, how we deal with those challenges. For those who are hoping to receive a real truth of this is the absolute canonical way for how BPM objects should align with TOGAF objects or Archimate, I'm afraid to disappoint you. I would love to be able to deliver that, but if the best minds in the industry haven't been able to get to that, nor can we. But there is work being done. There have been some excellent white papers on the Open Group site on, for example, how IDIL and TOGAF might align. And I'm sure as that process goes on, we'll see more formal models, but in the interim, here are some rules of thumb that we have found useful in meeting challenges. So I'll start off by briefly considering what goes into a framework. Talk about how the different frameworks interact in our experiences. And then, what methodologies do we use in dealing with these crossovers, dealing with these overlaps? And then an important point, which is probably obvious when you first start to think about this, is what are the human aspects of this? How does aligning different modeling efforts affect the organization? Because our organizational considerations, which, to be quite frank, will be as much of a driver as any technical consideration. of all, we'll open up the floor for any discussion and conclusions. Let's start by considering phrases and into them. Well, as I say on the slide, one key point about these frameworks, ITIL, COBIT, TOGAF, so on, is that they often deal with different but overlapping challenges. So TOGAF is very much around modeling your architecture and so on, whereas, say, COBIT is very much around governing. And what it means is they overlap in terms of meta model. For example, your models that you use to map ITIL might up with certain aspects of the TOGAF meta model, COBIT less so. There may be some crossovers in terms of framework may prescribe a notation or it may not, in which there's a question of how do we align those, do we want to align those? And they often include reference models as well, standard sets of how to do things. ITIL, for example, prescribes various processes and ways of working, has reference models for its architectures, so on. Now, bringing up now is a catalogue of some of the frameworks that we've encountered in the past. So I'm sure we all know, group architecture framework, and particularly targeted at service management. I'm going to explain that briefly for any US viewers. Prince is kind of the UK and Commonwealth analog to PMBOK. And then we've got development methodologies like Agile, UK, and it's called Federal Segment Architecture Methodology. Rational process for how you develop systems. A notation standard. COBIT talks about governance. So with that in mind, let's consider how these frameworks might interact. Way, and the most obvious way that we encounter in different frameworks and different models interacting is that the same objects appearing in different models. So if you can say a BPMN process representing a action of ITIL, or where you might handle your major instance, for example, the swings on your BPMN diagrams with the actors in your TOGAF models, for example. And at the same, the start events, end events, there's a direct correlation to the event object in the TOGAF meta model. Obviously, processes involve sub-processes and so on, and they naturally map to the process objects in the TOGAF meta model. It's one example of how, for example, the TOGAF meta model and the BPMN meta model that you might use for your process maps map onto each other. Now, related to the idea of crossovers of objects, we encountered there's a question of relations. We've talked about how a process on the TOGAF meta model is to a subprocess on the BPMN model. Likewise, swing an actor in BP maps to a TOGAF actor object, but in the BPMN diagram, the relationship between the actor and the process. It's the task or the process. That is the purpose of putting them on the swim lane. So the question immediately, are there analogous relationships in your models. In our top example, you see the relationship from actor to process, actor executes process, is directly analysis. In other cases, they may so. For example, in men, task may or process may access data entity. The token model doesn't have a direct actor to data entity, or sorry, process to data entity relationship. And when you have the same objects, it could be represented in diagrams in different ways. Consider, say, a project diagram, a Gantt chart, timeline chart on the side. I could map to your Archimate project implementation diagram. Last of all, there is notations question. A row swim lane could be the same as a shape on a UML use case diagram. So let's talk about how we look at touch points and how we resolve, how we decide what to do internally such crossovers. So, first of all, you can ask the question of what are directly aligned with each other, and for those, the best we found is examine well the naming. If it's called process in both frameworks, then that's often a good clue, but also examine the descriptions of them. Particular keywords are often useful in here. The first thing you have to decide in trying to align your different frameworks with each other. The question is, how do you handle relationships? We did earlier, running into the challenge of actor performs, or sorry, role performs, or role performs process. Does it align to, say, the TOGAF relationships or not? For example, in TOGAF you do have process orchestrates business service, control ensures correct operation of process. And you can find a direct analogy. Our general rule of thumb is just accept both of them in your integrated model that describes both frameworks. Because in general, the relationships are answering different questions, and often, as I said, the different frameworks that exist are there to answer different problems, different questions that exist. So the rules of thumb we've found very useful in resolving these conflicts, but as I've alluded, the real question is not at the technical level when you are considering overlaps between frameworks. Really, a question you have to pose is, do you actually want to do this? To put it another way, what benefits are you gaining from doing this alignment between different frameworks? Well, you may why on earth would I even worry about this, but the problem is a framework is describing a particular problem. ITIL is about service management, COBIT about governance, TOG architecture modeling, and so on. And this to mean it's different teams that are engaged in this modeling effort. And the problem is, with everyone working off the set of objects with this nicely aligned set of frameworks, what you immediately run into is perfectly aligned models. And one team starts working on a diagram the question of how to affect the other teams that are working on the program. So that requires a level of coordination between the different teams. Feel okay, why do we just let all the teams work away on the same set of objects? Hey, that's a benefit, isn't it? Transparency of what everyone's doing. Well, the problem we've run into in an awful lot of sites and customers is user conflicts. You might have your nicely defined, worked out ITIL processes and come along a bunch of business architects who are modeling certain tasks to other objects, and from the perspective of ITIL, they're basically changing signed-off models. So, implicit problem with aligning different frameworks to each other is the question of you can align them, but do you actually want to be modeling them together? Do you want to be engaging in that alignment process because you found it can cause as many problems organizationally as it was? It really comes down to what is the priority of the organization. Can it take advantage of those levels of alignment? Alternative approach is you can align the frameworks, but not necessarily use them in a single model. Depending on what you're using to model your entities, modeling tool allows separate models, ordering it by hand. You may find that it's to have two separate models, each using the two different frameworks. You can alignment work, but have a single model, have multiple models for all teams, align multiple frameworks, and synchronize between them on a regular basis. It's elegant, but often organizationally, we found that that's a smoother route. Implicit is that you have some level of governance over the synchronization. A few notes on challenges that we've experienced in aligning different frameworks together. Quickly look at the inclusions of all this. A problem we face is that there's not a lot of formally signed off, worked out alignment between frameworks. But it's possible to follow these rules of thumb, particularly use the definitions, use the naming, and inclusive approach for the relationships, the dependencies, because often the relations that are being described are used for different purposes. The key point that we've taken away from our experiences in this area is the organizational question is more important than the technical question. If you do this alignment, does it mean that you want to work off a single unified model? Because as you do that, that implies ahead and restrictions in the level of coordination that you have to follow. So consider the organizational question before you even start trying to work out how you're going to keep your models in sync, because you try and decide the benefits you're going to get from that are going to be weighed by the overhead and the chief of trying to get your teams working together. As I say, that is largely been driven in our experience by the level of maturity of the organization. It's a fairly short and sweet presentation. At this point, I'll open the floor for any questions.
Lee, thanks for that. Let's have a look through some of the questions we have. And by the way, if anyone wants to submit a question, as I said at listening, please use the QA facility, address your question to all. That way everyone gets to see the questions that are being asked. I didn't say at the beginning of this presentation, this is kindly a number in a series of events that we're running. We're trying to address some of the core practical issues surrounding the implementation of enterprise architecture. So I hope this is to bring some helpful hints and tips for day-to-day jobs. So just going through some of the questions we have on the QA facility. We have a question here from Ben, and just asking, I think, some clarification between the term of the use of model or framework, Peter.
Yes, I suppose that's my fault. Really, a framework is something that you're using to create your model, usually. ITIL is a framework that comes up with recommendations for how you run your service desk. In adopting it is that you're going to model your processes, model who you are going to resolve first-level instance, as an example. So I've kind of used the term framework and model a little interchangeably because, really, why do you even want to bother aligning the frameworks if it's not to try and get some value of crossovers between your models? So that's the reason why I've veered between the two. It's with that in mind, and perhaps I should have made that a little clearer at the start.
Okay, Peter, no worries. We have an observation or a question from Tim O'Neill. We know Tim, so I'll read it all out to you, Peter, and just let me know if you can address this. Tim, he says, I guess it's healthy to them here, but OMG, BMM, so that's Business Motivation Model, BMN and UML. It's pretty good stack that completely overlaps TOGAF 9, TC1. Have the same objects rendered both.
Well, yeah, there, Tim, you're largely preaching to the choir. I'm a big fan of BMM and UML, and I would agree that, taken together with BPMN, that really overlay the whole of the TOGAF stack. Really, problems that we've faced is run into other standards. For example, the Federal Enterprise Architecture's CRM. We've run into things like SysML. We've run into DODAF's CADM, and with DODAF 2 the new meta models. So, absolutely, if only it were that simple. But no, I totally agree with you, and thanks for bringing that up.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Pranab. Pranab's asking, can Archimate solve this problem if new tools comply with Archimate?
Well, I in that, but insofar as effectively, if you adopt Archimate as your only framework, then you are really removing the problem as such. As was mentioned, there's a full set of frameworks out there from the OMG, which are TOGAF. And if you just mandate Archimate and maybe migrate the rest of your models into the Archimate space, absolutely. Unfortunately, I don't think, well, it's not been our experience that the market is there yet. And as we go into new customers, we find a hodgepodge of different standards, frameworks being used by teams for different purposes.
Peter, I've got a question here from Guy Watchu. I'll read it out and see if is it an existing software or blueprint used in an alignment job?
So, software or blueprint useful in a alignment job. Well, if you're trying to understand how, if you really need to align your different objects, it is true that you can supplement the definitions of what objects are with the examples. have found that useful where we come into a place and they've got some proprietary framework or indeed a de facto framework that they've adopted, so formal codification. But yeah, there are sometimes grey areas. People are not so comfortable with the definitions of the difference in an actor and a role, for example. So in those cases where it's not totally clear, even from definitions, we have looking at examples to be able.
Okay, and Peter, Guy is adding some further clarification. He's asking, or he's suggesting, alignment job is the objects governance area, isn't it?
You'd say that it's really more of a meta-model governance area than an objects governance area, I would say. So if we were to devolve back to the TOGAF EM, it would be the kind of thing you would do in your preliminary phase, ideally. Governance, but I would say more of meta-model and architecture capability setup than governance objects ongoing.
Okay. Tim's come back with a secondary question. So saying, okay, we've talked about diagrams, which you call a model. What about other views like catalogues, matrices, charts, roadmaps, 3D? Says, for example, he says, without these or simulations, I'm just drawing pictures.
Well, I've used diagrams particularly as my starting point just because the nature of a presentation is that it tends to be visual, just a bit nicer to look at than, say, catalogues and so on. But absolutely, diagram is just one way of representing your underlying model, and principles of how you try and align relations, how you align objects and so on, by whether you're describing them as catalogues or as these or as charts. So I think the analysis really is there, no matter how you present them. It's just that we've chosen to use diagrams particularly here because it is a visual medium that we're using today. Okay.
Bedford asks, how widely used is Archimec tool within government and industry? Do you have any about that, Peter?
I would say not as much as I'd like. I would estimate maybe 10% of the organisations we talk to know Archimate, although we get very enthusiastic uptake when we tell them about it. The we've ever had pushback from Archimate is particularly where they're very used to, say, network modelling shapes. But really goes down to a question of whether, how you can do your presentation. In terms of the meta model, not as much take as I'd like, but I think that's more just a case of it's permeating through the industry, and it permeates further.
I'll ask a question there, Peter. If they're not using Archimate, what are they using in general, in your experience?
Anything and everything. TOGAF is probably the most common. Sometimes they're drawing diagrams in UML, and they do corn UML into other conversations, the whole of TOGAF and EA. And quite often, they're really considering the question of books or meta models. There's a little education exercise that we go through there.
Okay. Good. Ben Hugh is asking this. I think this is a very common question or request. He's asking, are there any real business cases or examples that people could look at?
Unfortunately, the one we've done are specific proprietary, so it's very difficult, obviously, for us to share customer data, and it's just a question of how being able to invest the time in anonymizing such work enough we could realistically share it. So it's that it's one of the things that we will be.
Challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, thing that it's something that we've got on to-do list. It's something we will be doing, and have it available on our downloads at some point, because we do try and share with the community. But actually, we don't have anything like that to share today.
Okay. Ben's come back with a secondary question. He asked, can the model be aligned with, say, balanced or performance scorecards on in PPT?
Yes. So, absolutely. By recording different attributes against objects and doing aggregation of their values, so effectively KPIs, recording KPIs against objects in your meta model, then you derive your balance scorecard, your headline. It's really a question of how do you get to that aggregation. And it's really, then it becomes a question of considering, if you're using a tool, what kind of reports could it extract? Can it be aggregation for you, or can it spit things out the way things be aggregated? If it's not a tool, it's a question of, well, get out information to do the roll-up and the aggregation. I think that's actually quite a fertile area of research in TUF. Just maybe, Simon, you could feed that back to the powers that be within the open group.
Yeah, certainly. Good. Well, there are no other questions on the QA, and I've looked through chat and I can't see any there. So I think at this stage we will draw the event to a conclusion. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in today's event. And please do keep an eye on the Open Group's event webpage, because we do have a growing list of webinars coming up between now and the end of the year, and we would encourage you to join us at those events. I'd like to thank Peter for the presentation today, and on that note, I will close the event. Many thanks, everybody.